Well, welcome everybody to the one of the very first webinars held by the Prairie Conservation Forum. We're about to begin a presentation by Kristi Gordon on the testing of management intensive cattle grazing as a restoration tour in semi-arid rangelands. So I'd like to begin by first of all just reminding everyone that currently they've invited to this meeting and their microphones are muted. Please keep them that way because we are going to have a number of attendees. Throughout the presentation, if you've got questions for Kristi, we really encourage you to please write them down through the chat function and send them to us, the webinar organizers. We'll compile the questions and we'll have lots of time for questions after Kristi's presentation. I'll moderate the questions at the end of this presentation and we'll go through all the questions and make sure there's lots of answers provided to you. I'd like to begin with just a brief introduction to the Prairie Conservation Forum, and then I'm going to introduce Kristi and turn the floor over to her. So the Prairie Conservation Forum was established to show Alberta's support and commitment to conserving, protecting, and managing native prairie and parkland species, their communities, and habitats. It was initiated by the World Wildlife Fund Canada in conjunction with the provincial governments of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And it is to show a prairie-wide vision for the preservation of Canada's prairies. Membership in the PCF is free. Donations are tax deductible. And we invite you to check out the Prairie Conservation Forum at albertapcf.org. That's org. So I'm very pleased today to introduce Kristi Gordon and her presentation on testing management intensive cattle grazing as a restoration tool in semi-arid rangelands. Kristi is a Master of Environmental Science at the Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia, a great place to be. She completed her National Resources Science degree in 2017 and earned a certificate in environmental monitoring from the University of Northern British Columbia. She has worked as a consultant and for the Invasive Species Council of British Columbia. Her current research tests the efficacy of targeted cattle grazing to control the invasive plant spotted knapweed in semi-arid rangelands. I'd like to remind you that Kristi will be graduating this year. So if you or your organization is seeking to hire someone with a particular expertise in cattle grazing, weed management, and restoration of native prairie, I ask that you keep Kristi Gordon in mind. And with that, I'd like to turn this presentation over to Kristi, and we'll have questions and answers immediately following her 20 to 25-minute presentation. Kristi.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Mark, for the introduction there. And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in today. I really appreciate it, and I'm really excited to share my research today. I'd just like to thank the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum for inviting me to present. As Mark said, my name is Kristi Gordon, and I'll be talking about my master's research, which entitles Management Intensive Grazing as a Restoration Tool in Semi-Arid Rangelands. So again, just before we get started on the webinar, just to reiterate, I'm currently in my second year of the Master of Environmental Science program at Thompson Rivers University, and I live in Kamloops, British Columbia. And here we're really surrounded by native grasslands, and that's what really inspired me to pursue my master's, just in an effort to help preserve these systems. So I love working with invasive plants and invasive species in general. And that's really what my career has consisted of thus far. I've worked a lot with biological control insect programs, so using specialized insects to target invasive plants, and as well as herbicide application and providing general education and outreach on invasive plants. So that being said, let's get started. So I'll start with a brief outline of the webinar and some objectives, the things we'll cover today. So first, I'll provide some background on grasslands in British Columbia and the threats that they currently face. And secondly, by the end of this webinar, you should have a good understanding of both management intensive grazing and targeted grazing, which are two specialized grazing management systems. Then we'll review the benefits and the challenges that come with implementing management intensive grazing. And then finally, I'll touch on my current master's research, which helps implement these intensive grazing practices to help restore semi-arid rangeland that has been invaded by spotted knapweed. So grassland ecosystems compose just 1% of British Columbia's land base, yet they're of great importance. So ranchers depend on the health of native range to produce quality product. Grasslands are home to a variety of endangered wildlife and plant species, such as the burrowing owl and American badger. Also, grasslands can even help mitigate the effects of climate change through the uptake and storage of atmospheric carbon. But as many of us know, grasslands face many threats, one being overgrazing. So literature shows that the heavy continuous grazing of grasslands can reduce the biodiversity of native plant species. It can expose bare mineral soil, leading to erosion, as well as the opportunities for invasive plant encroachment. Overgrazing can also limit the long-term storage of soil carbon due to the loss of organic matter. So another threat is invasive species. So spotted knapweed in particular is an invasive plant that poses a great threat to the BC ranching industry and to our grasslands. So this plant has invaded over 2.9 million hectares in North America. Some biology, it's a perennial to biennial, or short-lived perennial, sorry. And one plant can release up to 1,000 seeds, allowing it to form these dense monocultures. They're also believed to exude allelopathic chemicals through their roots and into the soil. And this is believed to inhibit the growth of native plant species. So unlike their graminoid or grass counterparts, spotted knapweed lacks the extensive root structures that the perennial bunch grasses typically have in our grassland ecosystems. So instead, knapweed has this big taproot, which you can see in that picture there. And this can access deeper soil water and nutrients compared to our native plant species. This can also reduce the soil stability, leading to erosion, especially when they form large patches. Research has also shown that large patches of spotted knapweed can also uptake greater soil nitrogen and carbon, therefore decreasing the availability of these elements for the native plants. So if you're at all familiar with the invasive plant industry, you know that it's costly to remove and treat these species. So in 2004, it was estimated that $400,000, knapweed was costing ranchers up to $400,000 in crop losses annually. But that estimate didn't even include the cost of mechanical or brush removal or herbicide application. So if you can imagine that number, it's increased substantially in today. Also, recent research out of the East Kootenays has detected populations of knapweed that are showing resistance to commercially available herbicides, such as picloram. So therefore, it's a really ongoing problem, and there's a need to develop locally relevant management strategies that not only focus on weed suppression, but ecological function as a whole, restoring that. But so what can we as land managers do to help with this solution and helping restore these invaded rangelands? So one thing we can alter in these systems is how we manage our grazing. So what is grazing management? Grazing management, as defined by Alan Dobb and many other sources, is the manipulation of grazing to achieve an objective or a set of objectives. And as some of you may know and recognize, grazing management practices are broad, and there's many forms of it, and ranchers often adopt grazing practices based not only on their land management objectives, but their landscape type, the climate they're living in, and the resources that are available to them. So these factors can also change from year to year. So it's really an adaptive management tactic, grazing. So it helps to view grazing management along a continuum, which ranges from extensive grazing to management-intensive grazing, whereas extensive grazing is typically viewed more as traditional continuous grazing practices. So in Canada, approximately 66% of Canadian beef producers currently utilize a form of extensive management, whereas the remaining 34% practice a form of intensive management. So management-intensive grazing it usually involves grazing small paddocks at high stocking densities, and then moving the animals oftentimes on a daily basis through, and this is done either through permanent or temporary fencing. So if you can see in this image here, we just have very small enclosures with long periods of rest. Whereas in an extensive or continuously grazed system, the animals graze pastures freely at lower stocking densities. And here the animals have the opportunity to regraze preferred forage. The grazing also won't be as uniform because, as we know, cattle and grazing animals tend to be selective, and this may lead to some areas being overutilized. So as we move forward with management-intensive grazing and this discussion, it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to grazing management. Every situation is different. So in terms of topography, your type of soil, plant community, whether it's native or agronomic, and the type and number of animals available. But we just want to keep in mind that the main goal of management-intensive grazing is to balance the health of our land, so your vegetation and soils, with the production of healthy livestock. So one of the key concepts with management-intensive grazing is take half, leave half. And this is really a rule of thumb that's thrown around quite often in the range industry. So at least 50% of your standing biomass should remain post-grazing. And really having more residual biomass following grazing will provide a larger leaf area and therefore allowing the plant with a greater photosynthetic ability to regrow. So you can really think of these plants as solar panels, or your leaves as solar panels. So therefore, the smaller the leaf area, the smaller the energy output for above and below ground plant growth. And this picture on your left here really illustrates the importance of residual biomass and percent use. So any material that's grazed greater than 50%, we begin to see the suppression of not only above ground, but below ground plant growth. So with 90% use, nearly 100% of roots are suppressed for nearly 17 days. So when I think of intensive grazing management, I really tend to think of it on a landscape scale. So we're not only looking at the above ground processes, so your cattle and your forage, you want to think about the soils as well. So maintaining and enhancing the formation of roots is essential for soil stability, for one, as well as preventing erosion, which is quite common, especially in semi-arid environments. So we want to keep our organic matter at a good level. So this helps with water holding capacity as well as infiltration. Another thing is to, with intensive grazing, is that it discourages the use of tilling. And this is a practice that typically reduces the organic matter in your soil, as well as decomposition rates are reduced, leading to nutrient and carbon losses. So when a pasture is divided into many of these small paddocks, there's sufficient regrowth post-grazing. The livestock may be allowed to take a second pass or regraze the area. And livestock can benefit from the taller forage plants. So cattle in particular tend to graze optimally if the plants are 4 inches or greater. Otherwise, we begin to see reduced forage intake and reduced body condition over time. Livestock, they also act as natural fertilizers consisting of their manure and urine. So these nutrients will be more distributed, and this can reduce the cost of applying synthetic fertilizers and the cost of purchasing them as well. So that being said, there are some challenges that come with implementing intensive grazing management, but we've talked about the benefits, and it can be worth the while. So when implemented properly, producers can experience enhanced forage production and soil health while also improving the body condition of their cattle, making more profitable returns for the rancher. But so management intensive grazing is much more labor intensive than in your traditional or continuous grazing systems. The animals need to be monitored, oftentimes fairly regularly, and moved in an efficient way. So either again through herding or through some sort of permanent or temporary fencing developments. Water is also an issue when it comes to intensive grazing practices. So there either needs to be those permanent or portable water developments for the cattle within each of those grazing paddocks. There's also a greater initial investment of income required to implement this type of grazing, such as the cost of fencing, any nutrient supplements to help with distribution, water developments as well, and more. So for instance, this can make, in British Columbia, of Crown Range, which the cows can come in and graze, and this makes implementing such practices quite difficult. There are limited options for fencing and water developments, and it would be very costly to pursue on such a large land base. But with that in mind, it's important to start small if you're deciding to implement such grazing practices, and only invest in the essential equipment or supplies that you'll need, and then you'll figure out what works best with your property. And it's remember to be patient. So depending upon your management goals, it can take several years to establish an effective intensive grazing plan that works not only for yourself and your property, but for your animals as well. And the third, be adaptive. So intensive management is really adaptive management. You want to ensure you have good goals established, and you can adjust paddock sizes and grazing stocking rates when necessary or in response to changing climatic conditions as well. So that was just a general overview of management intensive grazing. So let's just switch over to targeted grazing. So this is considered to be a form of intensive management. However, the duration, intensity, and season of grazing is altered to achieve specific land management objectives, such as the control of invasive plants. So spotted knapweed was originally believed to be an unpalatable species due to a bitter tasting compound it contains, semi-arid. But research has shown that cattle and sheep will readily eat knapweed, and goats as well, at all life stages. So previous clipping studies has also shown that when you clip at the bud to early flowering stage, you can see a reduction in seed production. So with this in mind, we want to start developing our targeted grazing strategy in our study site. So in terms of developing a targeted grazing plan, there's several things that you want to consider and think about. So first, you want to set up your landscape objectives. Or objectives, you may just have a singular objective. So do you want to reduce fuel loading in a specific area, help control an established population of invasive plants? This is what you want to determine first. And second, you'll develop your targeted grazing strategy. So here's where you'll consider the type of livestock you'll be using and how you'll get the livestock to focus on your established objectives. Then you'll decide whether you'll use supplements or different containment strategies. So we'll use nutrient blocks to try to get the cows after their target, or we'll use fencing to contain them, and then they'll have to go after your plant. So third is monitoring. So you want to ensure that your landscape objectives are not having any adverse effects on your landscape. So such as overgrazing your native plants, trampling in riparian areas, for instance, and etc. And finally, once you have your grazing strategy developed and you've been monitoring, you definitely want to reassess and adapt in accordance with any changing climate conditions, any economic situations, or environmental conditions. And in terms for an invasive plant strategy to be successful, it's recommended that strategies be long-term, plant-specific, and incorporate methods of reducing that seed bank. So that really brings me into my thesis research, which helps determine the efficacy of using cattle to help control the invasive plant spotted knapweed. So for my research, my first objective was to test 3 cattle grazing systems for their ability to improve plant composition and productivity or biomass production. We want to see how it altered the soil physical and chemical properties, as well as soil carbon storage. So we were testing management intensive grazing, the extensive or more continuous grazing, and targeted grazing. And my second research objective was to determine the efficacy of targeted grazing to suppress spotted knapweed. So my research was located in Merritt, British Columbia, so it's about 45 minutes south of Kamloops, and our plots were located on Crown Range. So where the current range use plan follows a spring-fall rest rotation. So in early June, there's typically 500 cow-calf pairs in this pasture, and they graze for about 10 days. And then the following year, it's grazed in mid to late September, again for 10 days by 500 cow-calf pairs. So the dominant vegetation at my site consists of Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass, lupin, yarrow, and of course, spotted knapweed. There's plenty of it out there. And we established 50 by 50 meter electric fence enclosures, and we had 2 enclosures for each treatment. The extensive enclosures were grazed in mid-September using a low stocking density for a long grazing duration, whereas the intensive treatments were grazed at a higher stocking density for a short duration. The targeted enclosures were grazed in late July to correspond with spotted knapweed's bud to early flowering stage. And this is believed to, our goal was to reduce the seed production at this time. So for our methods and data collection, we were out there and measuring plant community composition and taking biomass samples at 2 time periods coincident with the grazing periods. We also did soil sampling at 2 different sampling depths to get an idea of how the cattle grazing was influencing the soil properties. And then we also took measurements on knapweed plants. So we had permanently tagged 160 knapweed plants and monitored them over the growing season. And these were harvested in September prior to seed dispersal. And this would give us an idea of potential seedling production and therefore further invasion. So here are some preliminary results that I'd like to share. I'm currently in the data analysis stage and just looking at all my data that I have now. So this graph depicts the percent plant cover by functional group. So we have our grasses, our forbs, and the invasive species being spotted knapweed. And we found that extensive or that traditional continuous grazing practice significantly reduced the percent cover of grasses. And we also found that the targeted grazing appeared to reduce the knapweed cover over time. And this is where the results get pretty exciting for myself. So this is the before and after shot of the targeted grazing enclosure. So we can see that there was a very distinct difference in the flowers post-grazing, but we really wanted to quantify this. So what impact did the cattle have on the knapweed plants? So in last year's treatment results, we saw that 78% of those monitored plants were grazed. And of those grazed plants, an average of 17.2 centimeters of plant material by height was removed. So this is one of the images of those grazed knapweed plants, and you can see no buds or flowers remain. So we also found that spotted knapweed or the targeted grazing treatment caused a significant reduction in the number of mature seeds and seed heads produced. So you can see the average number of seeds for the targeted treatment was only 32, or sorry, it was 3.8 for the targeted plants compared to our control, which had 32 seeds per plant on average. And similar trend with the seed heads. So this was really an exciting result for us, just because we knew that was making an impact and the cattle were going after the plants at this time. So another interesting component to my study, we harvested biomass prior to the targeted grazing treatment in late July. And we want to see the nutritional differences between the knapweed and the mixed grass community, so the other main source of forage for the cows. So a wet chemistry analysis was conducted, and we found that spotted knapweed at the point of targeted grazing contains greater crude protein, as well as total digestible nutrients than the mixed grass community. And the lower ADF and NDF values, which are measures of fiber, indicate that knapweed is also more easily digested at this time. So the next steps in my research are analyzing our vegetation data. So here we're really expecting to see increased species diversity and productivity with intensive grazing management. Normally when grazing is removed from a system entirely, the diversity tends to decrease. Also, we expect intensive grazing management to promote the above and below plant growth. So when compared to the extensive or continuous grazing system. So therefore, we expect to see greater organic matter inputs over time. And this is what I'm currently in the lab working on, is my soil analyses. So at the end of this project, I've partnered with the BC Cattlemen's Association, and we're hoping to develop a targeted cattle grazing protocol for spotted knapweed control in these semi-arid rangelands. So I feel like there's a real need for these locally relevant applications, just so ranchers have something to look to help get started on developing these plans. So this will really provide a summary of our research results, and I'll summarize the existing literature out there to produce recommendations for ranchers. And this would just provide them with an alternative management tool to help control their knapweed and even other invasive plants. So overall, we found evidence to support that targeted cattle grazing is effective in suppressing the knapweed seed production, and it may aid in the restoration of these native plant communities that have been invaded by spotted knapweed. So as a result, incorporating targeted grazing into these integrated weed management plans may reduce the costs of repeated chemical and mechanical treatments over time and reduce herbicide use overall. So thanks very much for listening. I'd again like to thank the Prairie Conservation Forum for inviting me to present, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Christy. And I just want to remind our audience to please send any questions you may have through the chat line. And while we're waiting for a few of those to come through, we do have one or two that have been posted already. If you could just bear with me, Christy. When spotted knapweed was reduced, did you see other plants, other forbs replace them, or were they replaced with grasses?
Yeah, so this is something I'm currently looking at in my analyses for my data. So I'm just currently summarizing it, but just from a visual perspective, there was increase in forbs. So this is something I'll be looking at more closely when I look at my data. Yeah, so this is something we just want to make sure that there's no adverse effects happening from this targeted grazing treatment at the same time. So this is something I'll be looking into.
Okay, and perhaps the question I had is, did you look at percent cover? Did removing or reducing the spotted knapweed, did it open up the ground to perhaps more exposure, like wind or rain erosion?
Yeah, so I do have that data as well, but I just didn't have it summarized in this time. But yeah, this is something I'll also be looking at. But we did see a reduction in the percent cover of knapweed. So that's something we originally were going to do a seed application when I first started this research, but just due to time restraints, that didn't happen. But that's definitely one of the concerns with removing such a large amount of knapweed at once, is it may open up the opportunity to expose that bare ground, as you said. So reseeding may be a potential option afterwards as well.
Great, thank you. And so, are there any other questions for Kristi? Please send them in. Now's your chance.
Hi, Mark. There are questions. There's quite a few in the question box. So if you open them, and sorry, Tracy, I sent you a message about that. But yeah, there's quite a few there. So enjoy those questions, Kristi.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that greatly. Oh, wow. Look at them all. See, and I was looking just in the wrong place. Okay. See what we can do. Please bear with me. In semi-arid grasslands, they are subject to drought. Does this require flexibility to move from MIG to more traditional systems such as deferred rest rotation so range health and litter is maintained?
Let me see. Yeah, so that is one of the problems with managing these semi-arid rangelands. So they are, like you said, they are prone to drought. Let's see. So does this require flexibility to move? Yeah, and that can be the case. So in this circumstance, we really want to see whether or not intensive grazing would be successful on these range systems because they typically are more difficult to do. So yeah, where I really see this research being applicable is not so much like on the large scale crown range, but more so for small scale ranchers who do have those pockets of spotted knapweed, and then they could implement some sort of tool similar to this and hopefully see some good results from it.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Jerry's suggesting that in long-term drought, destocking for a number of years may be required. MIG might be more suited to irrigated land.
Yeah, definitely. So that is that's the challenge, the big challenge with implementing it on like these large land bases, especially in the semi-arid range. So yeah, most management practices are like most commonly on irrigated agronomic pastures. And yeah, there isn't quite as much research done on these semi-arid range. So we just want to test it and see what we discover with doing it in these unirrigated systems.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one, if I may. In a Milk River pasture, it has both spotted knapweed and Dalmatian toadflax. Does targeted grazing also reduce toadflax?
Yeah, so from what I understand, toadflax, it can increase when it has these rhizomes, so that's how it reproduces. So if it is grazed or cut using mechanical treatment, that can sometimes promote the growth of the plant. So Dalmatian toadflax is a tough one in that respect, and it oftentimes requires that chemical treatment to get it to remove it.
Yeah, that's what was being
suppression.
Great. Yeah, that's what they're also suggesting. They currently use biocontrol for knapweed and an herbicide for the toadflax.
Yeah, so that seems pretty common to what I've come across as well for toadflax. It's one of those tough plants to remove once it's become established.
So has knapweed management moved beyond control to using it as a forage, especially in areas where knapweed is out of control or beyond control? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so using knapweed as a forage, I think there's a big misconception with knapweed, and many people still think it's an unpalatable plant and that the cattle won't go after it. But when we were out there like observing their behavior, they were really going after it at the point of grazing where we had the cows in there. So the knapweed was still really green at this point, and it hasn't yet turned woody. And compared to the grasses at the time, they're just sitting dormant. So I think the cattle really utilized it as a good source of forage compared to the grasses at that point. So that was an interesting result as well.
Okay. Did you ever find knapweed density to the point where it was no longer palatable, or the cattle tended to avoid it? Like, was it ever beyond control?
At my study site, it was pretty well mixed in, but yeah, it was at a higher density, but there's still lots of native grasses available to them as well. But we didn't see them avoiding it at all. They seem to really go after it.
That's all right.
Let me see. Yeah, I'm just scrolling through the questions as well.
Yeah.
So
Well,
someone asked.
do you think, well, I've got another one for you if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Getting down through the list here says, do you think your research can be used for other invasive plant species?
Yeah, there's definitely lots of targeted grazing research out there, but I think there are many other plants that could be suitable candidates for targeted grazing. So not only spotted knapweed, but there's also the diffuse knapweed that may be applicable. Let's see what other plants are there. Yeah, there's a whole boatload of them really, but I could definitely refer you to some good resources on that. If you'd like to send me an email, then I'll follow up. But it would be applicable, I believe.
Great. Okay, thank you. And one of our listeners is asking you to please repeat the ideal grazing time for cattle on knapweed.
Yeah, so the ideal time that we chose was the late bud to early flowering stage. So this, for us, in our environment, it was in late July, so mid to late July. And this is really when the plant has not yet produced the mature seeds, which would have been concerned if we'd grazed it later, because then the cattle have that potential to spread the plant further. So we just hit it at the correct time so that it doesn't have mature seeds. And the timing for sheep and cattle. I've seen papers where they have grazed it slightly earlier with sheep, but I think the sheep would go after it at the same time as well.
Okay, what about the duration of grazing? Could you repeat that for cattle, first of all, and would the duration of grazing required be the same for sheep?
Yeah, so for the duration, we really had, so we used 10 cow-calf pairs within that 50 by 50 meter enclosure. And they were only in there for 1 day. And this was just to help prevent any overgrazing to happen. And we did have really good residual stubble heights for our grasses following that treatment. So we felt like we weren't overgrazing. So yeah, we just moved them out after 1 day. And I can't really speak so much to the sheep as I haven't really worked with them, but I can imagine, yeah, it would be something similar to just a very short time period, just such as a day, just so they don't go after, create any adverse effects.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks, or at least states, that you said that under MIG grazing, there was an increase in grass production compared to extensive grazing. But our graph seems to show that the grass production over 2 years was equal.
Oh yeah, so we didn't see a difference with the grass. Here, I'll just go back to this graph here. With the intensive management, we didn't really see that difference, a significant difference statistically with the percent cover. But we noticed a decline with the extensive grazing with our grasses.
Okay, great. Was there any evidence of increased invasive species, other species?
There was, we did have a presence of like a small component of cheatgrass as well. And I noticed in those the non-targeted enclosures, there was a presence there, but I haven't gone into the data that deeply yet to see if there's those differences or an increase or decrease yet.
Okay. Here's one I hadn't thought of. Were the cattle trained before the targeted grazing, or was the higher usage compared to MIG due to timing of defoliation?
Yeah, so that's one of the things about our study. So we didn't have any prior training for the cattle. So we just wanted to put the cows out at a time where we thought the plant would still be palatable for them and just see what would happen really, because most training programs for cattle that I've read, it can be quite a timely feat, and it just takes time out of the ranchers' day as well to try to get them accustomed to eating it. But we found that was quite successful even without the training. But let's see, was the higher usage compared? Yeah, so let me just read the second question here. Higher usage compared to MIG due to timing. Yeah, so I'll just get some clarification on that second question. So higher usage compared to management intensive due to the timing of defoliation. I'm not quite certain. Maybe you could clarify that question and then I'll answer that one.
Yeah, Neil, could you possibly clarify that question?
I was just wondering whether it was due to the timing, like you put them in there earlier season than you did on the management intensive. So that accounts for the difference there. That's all I was interested in.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
So let me understand then, if you were to introduce a cattle too late in the system, could it actually spread more seeds or contribute to a greater seed distribution?
Yeah, so that's something you really have to consider, and you really want to know and understand the biology of your plant before you implement a targeted grazing plan. So it's usually late August where the knapweed seeds become fully mature, so mid to late August. But at that time as well, the plant starts to become woody and more unpalatable for the cows. So I think we got at a time, you just want to make sure that you don't graze too late, that the seeds are mature. And as well, you don't want it so late that the plant's becoming woody. Otherwise, I don't think they'll go after it at all. Because in those other treatment enclosures or intensive and extensive ones, there was just so much standing knapweed that's just woody and it's just producing so much seed. So that's something to consider as well.
Okay.
Yeah, they just don't seem to go after it at all when it's big woody stems.
Okay, can't blame them. Okay, I believe that answers all the questions that were submitted to us. Just went another one. Okay, here's one more. Did I hear?
Yep.
Anything submitted through the chat? No, I don't see anything. Nope. Okay, I believe that concludes our webinar for today. I would like to invite all those listening to stay tuned for the next webinar put on by the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society in conjunction with the Prairie Conservation Forum. That webinar will be entitled, Why Grasslands? It is an exploration of grasslands intended for a public education and particularly a children's education forum. Details of that will be announced when the next Prairie Conservation Forum meeting is scheduled sometime for June. So I want to thank Kristy in particular for all your work and your presentation today. I thought you did a great job. You did a really good job answering the questions. I know I couldn't have answered a lot of those, so thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to say good day, stay healthy, and please stay tuned. Bye for now.